Top stories on ABC News. The biggest review of national security laws in 40 years has been made public. The Richardson review found existing legislation is needlessly complex and has been outpaced by technology. The central area for reform is an Electronic Surveillance Act, which will be a new landmark in Australia's national intelligence legislation. We are able now to take you live to Canberra to the Attorney-General, Christian Porter. Speak.
Welcome everyone and thank you for being here. So today the government is releasing the comprehensive review of the legal framework of the national intelligence community, known as the Richardson Review, and we're also simultaneously releasing the government response to that review. So I might start by thanking Dennis Richardson for his quite remarkable work in putting this review together and for his team. Obviously, Dennis was a former Secretary of Defence, of DFAT, Ambassador to the United States and Director General of ASIO, so he was uniquely suited and qualified to conduct this review. It is a colossal piece of work and it will obviously take all of those assembled some time to fully digest it, but what I intended to do today is just give as brief a summary as I can and then obviously open for questions. As noted in the House yesterday, there's no greater priority for our government than keeping Australians safe, and our national intelligence community is obviously central to that mission. They need to be properly resourced. They also need to be furnished with the appropriate legislative tools, and that's been a core focus of our government. And the threat environment has changed remarkably since 2001 and is changing very rapidly at the moment. And if you look back to the 9/11 attacks in 2001, since that point in time, parliaments under various governments have passed collectively more than 124 acts amending the national intelligence community's legislative framework. So I think that across both sides of politics, there's not been a complacency in ensuring that the legislative tools are there. However, it is a constant process of stress testing the legislative and structural framework to make sure that it's fit for purpose. And the pinnacle of that stress testing process is this Richardson Review. In May 2018, the government commissioned Dennis Richardson to conduct the comprehensive review of the legal framework governing the national intelligence community. That, in fact, was itself a recommendation of the 2017 Independent Intelligence Review. This is the most significant review into the national intelligence community since the Hope Royal Commissions in the 1970s and 1980s. And like the Hope reports, this report is meant to be a reference guide for national security and intelligence policy and lawmakers for the next generation of the operation of the intelligence community. The 18-month review process was exhaustive. Dennis was supported by a large multi-agency review team of 21 staff and engaged from everyone across the Commonwealth, state and territory agencies, international partners, civil society and the public to form his recommendations. So there is a 1,600-page classified report which contains 203 recommendations. That report was delivered to the Commonwealth late in December of 2019. There then went over many months a process of creating a carefully declassified report, and that is the report that the government is releasing today. The unclassified report is itself 1,300 pages and it sets out 190 recommendations. So there were 203 recommendations in full, 13 of those are classified recommendations. The other 190 appear in the declassified report that's being released today. Only 4 of the recommendations, the 190 public recommendations, are not agreed to by government, only 4. The 13 classified recommendations, none of those were disagreed to, but obviously they're recommendations that I can't speak to in detail here, but I will speak in some detail around the 190 recommendations, of which 186 were either agreed or agreed in part. Just also today we are releasing the government's response to the unclassified version of the report. That response itself is 52 pages long. And again, I'd stress that as outlined in that response, the government has agreed either in full or principle or in part to 186 of the 190 public recommendations. The 1,300 pages of the declassified report we're releasing today go across 4 volumes, and each of the volumes covers a thematic issue. The first is the foundations and principles and the control, coordination and cooperation of our intelligence community. There are 28 recommendations arising from that volume. The second is the issues of authorisations, immunities and electronic surveillance. There are 106 recommendations in that volume. The third is information technology powers and oversight. There are 49 recommendations. And the fourth is accountability and transparency, where there are 20 recommendations. And before moving on to make some comment about specific recommendations, I think it's worth touching on some of the key important thematic conclusions of the report. And there were essentially three of those. The first was that the report found that the key principles that underpin Australia's intelligence legislation are sound and that they are enduring, which is to say that we can still rely on those basic principles. They are principles which should continue to inform the roles, responsibilities and powers of the national intelligence community. And these principles are foundational. They are principles such as the distinction between foreign intelligence and security intelligence, the distinction between onshore versus the offshore activities of our intelligence community, and the distinctions that we make and draw between the protections for Australians versus non-Australians or non-citizens. The second basic finding, if I can put it that way, of the Richardson Review is that the legislative framework, whilst it's very complicated, when it's viewed as a whole, it has been well maintained and is largely fit for purpose. So it's operationally fit for purpose. But the report acknowledges that the active role of successive governments of parliaments have helped, while they have helped the legislative environment keep pace, there are clearly some changes that will need to be made in the coming months and years. The third matter of principle is the report notes that our intelligence community, and this is a very exhaustive review, it notes that our intelligence community is of the highest professional character and standards, that they operate with the highest degrees of professionalism, and that they have a very strong commitment and track record from exercising all of their powers and their operations and their functions inside the proper limits of the relevant governing law. So I think with that in mind, what the Richardson report demonstrates is that there is not a need for sweeping or revolutionary change to the system, but there are some areas where there needs to be change that is in its nature evolutionary insofar as it is meant, particularly in the telecommunications sector, which I'll come to in a moment, is meant to try and keep pace with a changing threat environment, but also a very rapidly changing technological environment. So, in speaking briefly before taking some questions to some of the key areas and recommendations, the first and I think the centrepiece reform that is recommended by Dennis Richardson is a creation of what would be an Electronic Surveillance Act, a consolidated legislative framework for all of the surveillance powers and warrants that exist inside the present system. There are a total of 57 of the report's recommendations that go to this issue of creating an Electronic Surveillance Act. And Mr Richardson considered that the existing legislation that governs electronic surveillance is too complex and it has now been outpaced by technological developments. So the new Act that he envisages would replace and streamline the existing powers in acts such as the Telecommunications Interception and Access Act, the Surveillance Devices Act, and also parts of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation Act. That in itself would be perhaps the biggest national security legislative project in recent history, and it would require the repeal and rewriting of nearly 1,000 pages of existing law on warrants, interception and telecommunications. And to give you a sense of the scale of that job that Dennis Richardson recommends, the Central Act at present is the Telecommunications Interception and Access Act. That was developed in 1979. Given that the scale and pace of technological change in telecommunications, it's actually been fairly durable and has lasted remarkably well, but the conclusion that Dennis Richardson reaches that it is no longer fit for purpose in the digital world of internet, smartphones, end-to-end encryption. And indeed he notes that many of the foundations of the surveillance framework date back to decisions made by Prime Minister Chifley in 1949. So the existing electronic surveillance framework, the Telecommunications Interception Act, the ASIO Act, the Surveillance Devices Act, they currently run to 933 pages. They contain 35 different forms of warrants and authorisations. They have become increasingly hard to navigate and are unnecessarily complex. The Telecommunications Interception Act which, as I say, was developed in 1979. In its original form, it was 19 pages long. Since 1979, it's been amended 107 times, and it's now 411 pages long. So the efforts that governments have taken to try and have that Act continually updated to keep pace with technological change have turned a 19-page Act into a 411-page Act. And Dennis Richardson's view is that, in combination with the other expansion of existing Acts, means that we need to consolidate the framework. He notes that the definition, for instance, of the interception of a communication, which is obviously a very important definition, runs itself for 3 pages, and it requires referral to 12 other definitions in the Act. So this would be a process which would start in earnest now. It would take, I'd say, between 12 and 18 months. In the UK, they had a similar process to establish the Investigatory Powers Act, and again, that took some time. To give an idea of the sort of complications in this, being the person that is responsible for signing many of these warrants, I carry with me an A3 laminated 11-point font sheet with me virtually everywhere I go. This represents the index that allows me to understand which warrant is being required under a particular Act, and then allows me to open up each of those Acts in consideration of each individual warrant. So this is the index, and each box represents a different Act or different warrant that we have to cross-reference. So you'll see that trying to consolidate that framework into a single piece of legislation with 35 different warrants being consolidated and 933 pages is going to be a large body of work. The report also makes a number of other notable recommendations. Some of those pertain to oversight of the intelligence community. Dennis Richardson's finding is that the oversight of the intelligence community is robust, but he recommends a series of changes. Those range from ensuring that the technical assistance to the Inspector General for Intelligence and Security is up to scratch. He recommends the issuing of new guidelines to ensure oversight is better embedded in intelligence community legislation. There is also a recommendation for improving the process for obtaining warrants in urgent situations. There are recommendations which go to a new framework for ASIO's offshore activities, which would strengthen ministerial control over ASIO's offshore activities and strengthen accountability for activities performed overseas in engagement and cooperation with foreign partners. I think also something to draw to your attention is that Dennis Richardson also made a range of important recommendations about what reforms he concluded should not be made, which were unnecessary for our intelligence law framework. I think notable amongst those, for example, is that Dennis Richardson did not recommend the introduction of an additional approval for warrants or authorisations above and beyond the executive or ministerial approval that occurs at the moment. That's sometimes referred to as a double lock system. Dennis Richardson's conclusion was that that was not necessary to be applied across the entire system. I would note from the government's perspective that the double lock system has been adopted from time to time in certain specific circumstances. The International Production Orders Bill is one example of that, which is part of the Cloud Act system. But the government agrees with Dennis Richardson's view that this is not a time for fundamental change in the introduction across the entire system of a double lock mechanism for warrants. The government response, including implementation and issues of transparency. So in line with the review's recommendations, the government response lays out a pathway for the ongoing evolution of Australia's security agencies framework. And as I noted, there are only 4 recommendations that the government did not agree with, and all other recommendations were either agreed with in whole or in part. So just before I have you ask all your many questions, I think one thing that's quite remarkable here, in a personal observation, is that living in a democracy where you can release a 1,300-page, incredibly detailed report into the intelligence community, which by its very nature is the most secret part of government, I think it's a quite remarkable thing to have hundreds of recommendations publicly known, to have only 13 of the recommendations requiring classification, and as I say, those are recommendations which are not disagreed to, and to have only 4 of the recommendations in such a detailed report not agreed to by the government, I think itself demonstrates the health of our system, the transparency of our system, and the fact that the system is one which people can have great confidence in, even in this necessarily secret part of the system, which represents the intelligence community working very hard, but in a particular way, which does involve secrecy to keep Australians safe at home and overseas. So very happy to have any questions that you may want answered.
Can you walk us through the reasons for disagreed recommendations?
Yes. So those 4 recommendations that were disagreed to, just very briefly on each of them. The first is with respect to a section called 13B of the Intelligence Services Act. Dennis Richardson recommended that not be extended. That section actually allows ASIS to undertake activities onshore to support ASIO. So ASIO will be predominantly working onshore here in Australia. That section allows for that assistance. Dennis recommended that it not be extended, and the government doesn't agree with that recommendation. Generally speaking, ASIS's assistance of ASIO in onshore matters is what is described as less intrusive activity. Very often it's information sharing and matters of that type. I think one of Dennis's concerns here, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think one of his concerns here was that not the fact of ASIS's assistance, but he didn't want there to be conflict or competition between 2 intelligence agencies working in Australia. We think that the better solution there is that the ASIS assistance under 13B is something that should occur at ASIO's request, so that you don't have assistance of a problem of competition onshore in Australia. So that's the first of the 4 that wasn't agreed to. The second was with respect to whether or not the criminal code should be amended to give Australian Defence Force members immunity for telecommunications offences. The other intelligence agencies have immunity in the criminal code for telecommunications offences. Dennis Richardson recommended that it not be amended to give Australian Defence Force members immunity. My understanding there, the rationale was that it was not entirely clear at the time of his writing why it was that the Defence Force needed those immunities. We've not agreed to that recommendation because we think that it is likely that there will be some very narrow circumstances where the Defence Force would need the same immunities that it provided to other intelligence communities, so we believe some more work needs to be done there. Thirdly, there was an issue with respect to enabling the Parliamentary Joint Committee into Intelligence and Security to request the IGIS to conduct an inquiry into the legality or propriety of a particular operational activity. Now, Dennis Richardson also considered whether the PJSIS, the Bipartisan Joint Committee, should have the ability itself to oversight. He determined that it shouldn't. Reflecting the fact that oversight has always been by independent agencies, independent of both the executive and the parliament. He did recommend that the PJSIS might have the ability to request the IGIS, the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, to oversight a particular matter or investigate a particular matter. We've disagreed with that recommendation. Our rationale as government there is that there should be complete purity to maintaining the independence of oversight by agencies which are inside but independent of the executive. The final issue was with respect to the fact that Dennis Richardson at recommendation 187 recommended that ASIC should remain subject to the Freedom of Information Act. That was disagreed with by the government, and we considered that basically after ASIC essentially was the result of a merger with Crimtrack, that the material that it is dealing with, ASIC, is now the type that it should remain exempt from the FOI Act. So there are 4 recommendations. We weren't expecting that, because this was obviously a very thorough independent review by Dennis Richardson, that every single recommendation would be agreed with, but perhaps it's been surprising the number of recommendations that have been agreed with and the very small number that have not been agreed with.
Attorney, there's one interesting aspect of it, and well, lots of interesting aspects, but with ASIO and its offshore activities, it appears that ASIO has been able to target Australians overseas without any ministerial request or oversight or approval. Has there been some activity of ASIO offshore that's driven this particular recommendation, that there be specific authority from the Attorney General?
Well, I'm sure that I don't know whether that can be answered yes or no publicly, but what I can say is that I'm sure that Dennis would have had case studies around the activities, and ASIO does undertake activities offshore around those activities, and the conclusion was that there should be a regime for ministerial approval for those activities like there is for domestic activities. So I don't have to hand what case studies he may have been considering specifically over the year-long course of his review, but I'm absolutely sure that he would have been considering case studies around the types of activities that it would now be the case, with agreement, that we would subject to the same sorts of oversight that we do for domestic activities.
What would your message be to everyday Australians who are probably hearing alarm bells when they hear words like electronic surveillance? Is this going to have any impact on them?
Well, the impact of our intelligence community and the various agencies that constitute our intelligence community is to keep Australians safe. I mean, necessarily investigations, whether they're into foreign interference or espionage or terrorism, they are investigations which by their nature are conducted out of the public eye, but they're investigations and techniques that are used to keep all Australians safe. And I think what has become clear, what's been said by the former director of ASIO, the present director of ASIO, what is clear in Dennis Richardson's review is that the threat environment is fluid, it's dynamic, it's real, so that when we say that massive amounts of work goes on to protect Australians, and it's work that happens necessarily behind the scenes, that is a real thing. But I think what Australians can take great comfort from is that we've had one of the greatest experts in this field, resourced to the tune of millions of dollars, being given open access to all of the agencies, not only to work out what things can be done better to keep Australians even safer, but also to assess whether or not the agencies who use these important powers are doing so responsibly, are doing so inside the confines of the law. And I think that when you read this report, he gives a very, very clean bill of health to the professionalism and propriety of the agencies. And he says specifically that the agencies consistently and to an exceptionally high standard work inside the law. So it's a system that is governed by the rule of law.
Minister, recommendation 5 about allowing ASIO to spy on Australians to collect foreign intelligence when they're acting on behalf of a foreign power. It seems there's a gap there that Dennis Richardson has identified. Has that been an impediment to doing foreign interference investigations, that essentially Australians, some may call them traitors, that we actually can't spy on because the definition of what they're doing doesn't fit?
So he has identified a gap. I think it's fair to say that the gap has been narrow but is widening, and so it needs to be addressed fairly quickly. And so recommendation 5 is that the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation Act and Telecommunications Act should be amended to enable the Director-General of Security, on a request from the Foreign Minister or Defence Minister, to seek a warrant from the Attorney-General for the collection of foreign intelligence on an Australian person who is acting for or on behalf of a foreign power. The circumstances of this narrow gap, I'm led to believe, look something like this: that someone, an Australian citizen usually who will hold dual citizenship, may at one point in time be overseas working for a foreign government, and they might be the subject of intelligence collection according to the law, with warrants based on the rule of law and all of the powers that exist and the protections that run alongside them. That person might be subject to that type of intelligence gathering whilst they're overseas, but then they return to Australia and are undertaking very similar activities, but the gap remains because of their citizenship. There are restrictions around the way in which you could get the same information that you were trying to get offshore, onshore. So that type of circumstance, as you could imagine, is arising with greater frequency. So that is a narrow gap which has the potential to widen quickly, and Dennis Richardson's identified that we have to close that gap. We've obviously agreed with that recommendation, but it is a problem.
Has it been an impediment to getting foreign interference investigations?
Well, I mean, let me say that if the gap exists, you could imagine that that's the type of area in which it would exist.
It also talks about there's an ability, he wants to close the ability of the Secretary of the Department and also the Solicitor General to issue warrants under certain circumstances. Can you give us an idea why, I mean obviously he wants you to have that power, but how many warrants are you issuing a year, and what sort of workload would this increase? How would it increase your workload?
I think that issue, Andrew, goes to the issue of the issuance of emergency warrants when the Attorney-General's not available. That happens very, very rarely. The workload, I don't have the precise number for you, I'm sorry. I think that these things are actually recorded and reported on to IGIS and to Insolent, but the workload is not inconsequential, but it's manageable at its present volume for one office, that office being Attorney-General. But the information is presented to the Attorney-General of the day in a very thorough and professional and digestible fashion. But what does not make that process easier is the fact that there are 35 different types of warrants. All of them have different types of rules and probities and restrictions and requirements. And so the process, which I go through on a weekly basis, sometimes more often than that, of actually sitting down and reading the material and cross-referencing it to the legislation is made more difficult by the complications of the legislative framework.
Just going back to that previous question.
This is where we say goodbye to our viewers on the ABC main channel. You can continue watching this news conference on the ABC News channel. Bye for now.
Essentially, yes. So the recommendation is that the Telecommunications Act should be amended to enable the Director-General of Security, so ASIO, to collect.
China's Deputy Head of Mission says the ball's in Australia's court to change relations with China. Do you think that's fair?
Well, I mean, all relationships are two-way streets, obviously. And I think one of the most important points that the Prime Minister has made, that a very consistent part of our relationship with China is that we've never had any interest whatsoever in the idea of a China whose economic growth is in any way curtailed, because we've been a partner in that economic growth. So I think that it's a relationship that requires improvement, obviously, but there's nothing particularly, I think, in the recent times that Australia would do any differently. But I think that the foundations for that improvement are there, but there is a degree of patience that needs to be exercised in that process.
He said today, actually, that China wanted to see concrete actions from Australia to provide a favourable atmosphere for that relationship. Can you think of any concrete actions that Australia could offer?
Well, I mean, again, I think that there's an extent to which there's going to be some patience required and dialogue, obviously. I think one of the difficulties with that statement might be that when you look at the list of 14 grievances, which the Chinese government has officially provided to describe what they perceive to be the problems with the relationship, they're things that were done that they wish were not done, in effect, rather than suggestions for positive changes. So this is going to be a matter of ongoing dialogue and patience, and there's obviously a lot of work that is going to be required.
You've had this report for a long time. Why is it being released today? Does it have anything to do with the tensions with China?
No. I mean, the first version of the report has to be carried around in a wheelbarrow, effectively. The thing's monstrous. So we took a year to consider it. We very much wanted to release all of the government responses to all of the public recommendations at the same time. That's a 6 to 9 month process. And the process of developing the 1,600 into the 1,300 page redacted but public version is a process that just doesn't involve ministers. That is Dennis Richardson going to the departments and all of the national security agencies and their heads and in effect arguing the toss. And Dennis and the government has been very, very forward-leaning in trying to ensure that as much of the report as can conceivably and safely be made public is made public. And people don't always agree on that. So there have been points of disagreement between heads of agencies and between Dennis and ministers have had to try and arbitrate between those different positions to ensure that as much information as in the public domain as can reasonably be safely put there.
Tony, given the language particularly directed at China over foreign interference, what do you say to dual citizens, for example, who are worried when they see these reports talk about surveillance on them, that they might be targeted because of their race, not because of any particular evidence against the fact that they might be.
That would just never happen. And I think when you read the Richardson report, people are targeted because of conduct. And when they are subject to surveillance or telecommunications interception, they are obviously very rare events, but there are standards that have to be met and prima facie evidence that have to be shown through a very highly scrutinised system. So this is about conduct and about high standards, and I think that Dennis's report shows that those standards are very high and met to a very, very high standard and have been over a very, very long period of time.
Mr. Porter, what is the biggest threat to Australia?
Well, it's a question when you read the Richardson report, which is very hard to answer. But the biggest threat is that we live in a time which is unbelievably dynamic and fluid. And prior to the events of September 11, the biggest threat that was perceived, say, in the American intelligence community was domestic right-wing terrorism. And then for a decade, we dealt with a very different threat in Islamic and international terrorism. And it's clear that there are growing issues with a range of matters that relate to espionage now in the modern age. And all of these things change very quickly, and they operate and pose threats side by side and together. So there is, in my observation experience over the last several years, this constant effort of our national intelligence community to make sure that they're devoting the right amount of resources to the right problems at the right time, and that is a continually changing threat environment.
Mr. Porter, can I ask you about the IR bill you're going to be releasing next week? It's an omnibus bill. I mean, it's going to have all the elements jammed in together. Clearly it'd be your intention to pass the lot. If one or two measures hits a snag in the Senate, would you be prepared to compromise, cut parts out of the bill, or is this going to be an all or nothing proposal from go to woe for the government?
Well, it's not going to be an all or nothing proposal. I mean, there's going to be 5 issues that are dealt with, which are issues that we think are creating barriers to employment. So the failure to have a definition of casual employment in the Fair Work Act, the complication in the award system, issues around compliance, issues with respect to the lack of long agreements for greenfield projects. Now, each of these issues is a separate issue. Each of them have their own complications. And so the bill, when it comes into Parliament, is very likely to go off to a committee to be considered over the summer period. And, we don't want to be obstinate about anything in the bill. We've had a process of developing the bill which has been consultative, which is not to say that everyone's going to love everything that's in the bill or agree with everything that's in the bill, but I would very much like to see that consultative process continue once the bill goes into Parliament. I will be listening very carefully, not merely to all the business groups, but also the union groups about their views on the final product, because it's quite clear that not everyone is going to love everything in the final product, and it has been something of a balancing exercise. But everything in the bill is designed to grow more jobs. So we think everything in the bill is important, but there are some things in the bill, that we will talk about clearly.
Mr. Porter, there was a report in the Australian in recent days suggesting that you believe that you were being tailed by a private investigator, indeed that you might have even been tipped off by Peter Dutton. Is there any veracity in that reporting?
I'm not sure that article said that I believed that. You hear weird things in politics. That was something that I heard. I dismissed it at the time. But, the nature of people following you around is that they do it in a way that you're not supposed to know. But look, can I just say, it's just a distraction. I can simply say if anyone ever did follow me around, they would have had a pretty boring time of it, to be frank. So.
Can I ask you on WA borders, Mark McGowan says he's going to consider over the weekend whether to close them to New South Wales and Victoria. Do you have any opinion on that? Would it be an overreaction to close them on the basis of the one case in New South Wales?
Yeah, so I think Premier McGowan has done the right thing in not making an instant decision after the one case that's been identified in New South Wales. So he had said previously that New South Wales having gotten close to the 28-day no community transmission mark, would likely be able to be open for travel between New South Wales and Western Australia, I think on the 8th of December. Look, this is one case. I think that it was right of Premier McGowan not to just go, right, there's one case, that previous timeline is off. He's obviously considering it. I hope that inside that consideration, which is obviously a decision for Premier McGowan, but inside that consideration, we'd give consideration to how safe things have been in New South Wales, how outstanding their record has been, given the size of their population, given the great challenges that they face. I think it would be a terrible shame in WA if you had borders closed leading up to Christmas, which is bad for families. It has a humanitarian cost. It's terrible for business in WA. It would be a bad thing for the state if you didn't have travel because of one case of community transmission in New South Wales. So I think Premier McGowan did the right thing not to make the decision instantly and to just give it a bit of thought over a couple of days.
Scientists around the country say they now face losing their jobs because they've missed out on a final round of medical funding. They say that 90% of applications were unsuccessful. Considering we're in a pandemic, shouldn't the federal government be prioritising scientists and medical research?
I'm not quite sure what funding stream that is that you're referring to.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Just on the threats, you listed a few there. How worried are you, given what we've heard from the ASIO boss and others about the sharp rise in right-wing extremism, and are you prepared to call that out as being a rising issue in Australia?
It clearly is, and it sits in the context of these other issues, but it has become a growing focus of ASIO in recent times, which it should be. And that's something that wasn't quite the focus it is now 4 or 6 years ago. But it just goes again to show that this threat environment is multi-factor, constantly changing, and the work of our intelligence communities is to focus on oftentimes many more than one thing at once.